everyone. I am really delighted to be invited to speak here. It's quite an honor to be invited from Canada to come and speak to people in the US. It's not something that you get asked to do very often, so I really appreciate the opportunity. I am an autistic individual. Well, technically I have autism and ADHD, just to make it really fun. I am a person on the autism spectrum, and I have a son who is neurodivergent as well. He's been diagnosed with PDD-NOS, with ADHD, sensory processing, learning disabilities, you name it. So today I'm going to talk to you basically about four sort of main areas, or try to cover two main aims across four sort of sub areas, and that's looking at challenging inflexible mainstream attitudes towards people with neurological differences like mine, like autism or ADHD. But then after we sort of pull that apart a little bit, I want to talk about the idea of presumed competence and autonomy, something called sparks, flow, and special interests, and then this idea of positive identity, belonging, and connection. And the overall sort of focus of my presentation, of course, is going to be on autistic well-being. So in order to achieve well-being, we first must understand the kind of things, events, feelings, activities, or pursuits, persons, and so on that make a positive contribution to our lives. So Barbara Frederick's broaden and build theory of positive emotion, it suggests that positive emotion broaden and builds our psychological resources so that we're able to draw on them in tough circumstances. So in other words, she was saying that positive emotion does much more than just feel pleasant. It's actually a neon sign that growth is underway and that psychological capital is building. In order to understand what is wellness, or what is wellness for someone with autism, I want to start with holding a positive identity, then moving on to belonging and connections. Then we're going to talk about sparks, and then we'll finish by talking about expertise. So building a positive identity. So imagine that it's the late 1970s, and there's a village in rural Ontario that is so small that it doesn't have a traffic light. Now, all the women in this village have gathered at a small church just a short walk from home for a special brownie potluck dinner. Now imagine a little girl in a brownie's uniform who is staring at a long line of potluck items spread before her, and she chooses nothing. Because this little girl is unable to eat almost any of the foods that she's offered. She eats only Cheerios and milk with breakfast, toast and peanut butter for lunch, and macaroni and cheese for supper. And she eats it every single day. Now, imagine that the caring adults around her notice the little brownie is eating nothing. So they say to her, "Don't you want to eat?" But this little girl, who can't be more than 5, has learned one lesson very well. There is something very wrong with her because she doesn't like to eat. She has seen and heard and endured endless battles to eat, endless trips to doctors and specialists, endless conversations about what is wrong with her. Why won't she eat? So when the likely well-meaning mother asks the little brownie why she isn't eating, the brownie instantly experiences intense shame. And that causes a spectacular meltdown. Because this little girl is unable to regulate even the simplest of emotions, and shame is well beyond her ability to cope. My biggest obstacle to living well is not my autism. It's my extremely fragile mental health. And my experience is not unique. Cribb and colleagues in 2019 interviewed parents and their adult children with autism about the extent to which they felt being autistic affected their child's current and future lives. The parents and the adult autistic children both agreed that co-occurring mental health issues were the biggest obstacles to their futures, with supports of severe cases of anxiety and depression. Recently, Swedish researchers examined the medical records of over 50,000 individuals with autism, and they found that autistics are 7 to 9 times more likely to engage in suicidal behaviors compared to non-autistics. This is why Jim Sinclair wrote in 2002 that there's a tragedy that comes with autism, not because of what we are, but because of the things that happen to us. To begin to understand why this might be so, we must first start by acknowledging the power of the constructivist principle. This principle states that what we believe about the world is constructed through our conversations or our stories about it. In this way, what we know and what we create are interwoven. In essence, the stories we choose to tell have the power to affect how we come to view ourselves and our circumstances, and thus they are considered fateful. When I reflect on my own experience, I realize that from a very young age, I had internalized that I was bad, that I was overly sensitive and overly emotional, that my needs were unreasonable, that I was unlikable, that I wasn't normal, and, as my mother loved to say, I had to change. And these beliefs, coupled with environmental stressors, led to anxiety, panic attacks, shame, depression, meltdowns, and further trauma. The diagnostic entity of autism is a subjective construct that is used by society to interpret and categorize behavior, affect, and ways of thinking. From this lens, a diagnosis of autism can be seen as a type of storytelling or narrative for explaining the contrast between the normal and the abnormal, or sameness and difference. Now, I don't want anyone to think that I'm suggesting that autism isn't real. It is real, obviously. But what I'm saying is that the meaning that we give to the differences between autistics and non-autistics is a type of storytelling. The medical model of disability rests upon two fundamental assumptions. The first is that there is one right, normal, or healthy way for brains to function. And the second is that if your neurological configuration or functioning differs substantially from the norm, then there is something wrong with you. The medical model has created stories of autism in which autistic people are inherently inferior to non-autistic people, that autistics lack something fundamental to being human, and that autism is something to be fixed, cured, avoided, or controlled at any cost. That becomes even more clear if you think of this CNN article, which was published not 4 years ago, telling families that drinking bleach to cure autism is a particularly bad strategy. We wouldn't have mothers making those choices if we hadn't pathologized autism to be something that needed to be avoided at any cost. So according to the medical model, autistic people are considered to have deficits or weaknesses that must be remediated. But the assumption that there is something wrong with us is inherently disempowering. Under the medical model, medical professionals are effectively going around and telling a population of people who are at much higher risk of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation that being autistic means to be fundamentally flawed as a person. Suggesting that being autistic means to be fundamentally flawed as a person and then behaving accordingly is a particularly bad way of teaching youth that they have value and worth. For we've not long known that one of the most central features of depression is a negative or undesirable feeling of difference from others. But there is another story of autism that can be told. For too long, we have used the metaphor of a computer to understand how our mind works. But the more we study the brain, the more we understand that it functions less like a computer and more like an ecosystem. Nobel Prize-winning biologist Gerald Edelman wrote, "The brain is in no sense like any kind of instruction machine, like a computer. Each individual brain is more like a unique rainforest, teeming with growth, decay, competition, diversity, and selection." In fact, the term brain forest is a truly excellent metaphor for understanding the brain, especially when we're discussing how the brain responds to trauma by redirecting growth along alternative neurological pathways, and to explain how genetic so-called flaws often bring both advantages and disadvantages. The term neurodiversity refers to the simple fact that all brains are different. If you could take every single virtue that any human on this planet could possibly have. There is no human that is excellent at every single one of them. The neurodiversity movement rests upon three fundamental assumptions. First, that diversity in human brains is valuable. Second, that a normal brain is a socially constructed fiction, and rather there is actually a wide variety of brains populating this world. And that the power inequalities and stigma experienced by neurodivergent peoples often mirror the social dynamics towards other minority identities, such as those as cultural or ethnic minorities or sexual and gender minorities. In 1979, an autistic advocate named Judy Singer wrote, "Just as biodiversity is essential to ecosystem stability, so neurodiversity may be essential for cultural stability." More than a decade or 2 decades later, Harvey Bloom wrote, "Neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. For who can say what form of human wiring will be best at any given moment?" I certainly love that one the most whenever you consider that idea of like Calvin and Hobbes. So if you took me back to like a hunter-gatherer society, someone who has this super hypersensitive nervous system and therefore is going to wake up at the first sign that a pattern has changed is the one who's going to save you all from getting eaten by a bear, right? So we don't know exactly what form of human wiring is going to be most successful given the cultural organization of our world. Autistic people desire to be seen as having positive attributes, strengths, and agency beyond a disorder or disability. While we often have more challenges than non-autistic people, the overall well-being of autistic children and their families is being harmed when we frame autism in terms of deficits alone. And so here on this slide, I've listed a whole bunch of different strengths that are often common among people with autism, but I'm going to return to this slide, so I'm not going to read it in detail now. So given I've sort of blah, blah, blah now for about 5 or 10 minutes around this positive identity thing, what should you do? What can you do differently based on this information? Well, the first thing I'll talk about is this idea of identity first language. So I am going back and forth between identity first and person first. So person with autism versus autistic person. The reason that I use autistic person throughout this document is to respect the fact that many autistics believe that autism is inseparable from our identity. Because really, where does my autism end and Heather begin? This language is also used to emphasize the fact that many of us derive strong positive feelings of affiliation to our autistic identity and the larger autistic community, which would be akin to someone being proud of your cultural or ethnic identity. For example, I could say I'm a proud Canadian in the same way that I would say I'm a proud autistic. To help autistic individuals form a positive identity, we have to remember that words are powerful. So before you describe the characteristics of autism, ask yourself, would I use this language if I were speaking to an autistic person? Or does my language unnecessarily other autistic people by suggesting that the characteristics of autism bear no relationship to the characteristics of normal people? And then lastly, consider, does my language suggest that autistic people are inherently inferior to non-autistic people, or assert that they lack something fundamental to being human? It's very small changes like these that influence our collective understanding of what autism is and help autistic individuals develop more positive identities. So I'm just going to take a very short, brief pause. Are there any questions?
How does this impact like severity levels? Because I know that often comes up as a question, right? And I don't know if you cover this as you're going through. And right?
I'm laughing because it's such a nightmare topic right now.
Right? So, and I'm wondering if maybe the short answer is
don't use them. That's the short answer.
Right? So,
So I can tell you a
right.
little bit of why autistic people get so mad about this. It's because
Yeah.
we don't have good measures of severity, right? So you can label someone as severely impaired based on, say, their verbal IQ score, but I could have a perfectly intact intelligence and have and be non-speaking, and therefore I would count theoretically as severely delayed. The other reason autistic people get so upset about this is because my functioning is highly dependent on the environment that I'm in. So you can say that I'm quote unquote low functioning if you stress me, put me in a highly stressed, very busy, very chaotic environment, and I will look perhaps quote unquote low functioning. But if you give me a supportive environment, I might look very different. So between the inaccuracy of our measurement, the idea that these labels are used to exclude autistics from services, which is sometimes done. For example, peer is a common intervention given to many autistic people. I'm not suggesting it's a good intervention, but it is an intervention often given, is not allowed if you've got an IQ less than 70. Like you're ineligible for these programs, right? But then if you measure my IQ with working memory, I'm sorry, this is so detailed, but if you measure using working memory, my IQ is going to look really terrible. But if you don't use that measure, my IQ might look really high. So does that sort of, I know too much.
I appreciate you jumping into it the way you did, because honestly, it was more of a, hey, can we just, along with thinking about the belonging, the connection, the identity, and all of that, can we also remember it doesn't apply just to this certain group, but all encompassing. So that was more of my, and I appreciate you jumping into it like that. So thank you.
You're welcome. And if I didn't explain anything properly because of lack of time, please make sure to ask me again later in the presentation or at the end. I'd be happy to talk about it more. Okay, and that is actually a common, so there's quite an argument right now between parents and autistics around that idea of, does this actually apply if my kid has an intellectual delay or is non-speaking or will never go to university? And even though they make that argument, I know that many people on the other side say, well, yes, it applies, because all we're asking for is that you remember our humanity first. And therefore, it does apply to all autistics. I'm not saying it doesn't get more complicated, but it does apply. Okay, so let's talk about the importance. So the reason we start with that sort of positive identity first is because the caveat or the takeaway message in all of that positive belonging stuff is that when disability is perceived as a weakness and not just a quote unquote different form of normal, it hinders one's what's called social participation. So Krieger and colleagues defines participation as referring to how a person's life is interwoven with the social life of their family, friends, community, and society. And it includes feelings of belonging and engagement, as well as having a sort of societal perspective. So in this presentation, I'm actually going to summarize a number of sort of qualitative studies that looked at how to support autistic well-being, because these qualitative studies give you firsthand perspectives or the lived perspective of what autistic people think and feel in their own words. And so this study, Lamb et al., is one of them. And so in Lamb et al., they actually used this thing called photo voice, where they were asked to take a bunch of pictures and then describe what those pictures meant to them. And then the researchers basically tried to figure out, well, what does autistic mean well-being look like for these autistic adults? And so the first sort of finding of their study, and what they actually literally labeled their article, is that autistic adults in this study, they offered rich descriptions of their positive well-being that reflected their unique individual differences, as well as a strong sense of connection with others in the community. And then that's why they said that the overarching theme of the whole study was that autistic people are different, but we're connected. Another striking example was that we often form really intimate connections with animals, and we will often view these as genuine friendships, and often even exceeding the quality of many of our human relationships. And it does make a kind of sense. And yes, those are both me. It does make a kind of sense because animals are non-judgmental, they're sensitive, they're always available for comfort and support. And they often allow us to cope with the stress. They provide us a sense of companionship, and they give us this sort of sense of unconditional acceptance. In another study that was looking at autistic women, it was one of the things, so that is actually my father on the right-hand side of the screen. And in the middle of the screen is another professor in my faculty named Dr. Veronica Smith. And so in this particular study by Webster and Garvis, many of the women spoke about the influential people in their lives who believed in them and subsequently enabled them to believe in themselves. So these influential people included family members, university professors, employers, romantic partners, friends, and coaches. And they're all viewed by the women as individuals who possessed knowledge, perspectives, and critical information that they felt they were lacking. So the women, these autistic women, had trust that these individuals would help them, give them the input they needed to act in a particular situation or to help improve their skills. More importantly, these influential individuals instilled in the women the belief that they could achieve goals and be successful in different aspects of their lives. And that's certainly true with these two mentors on the screen. So my father, even though he is 73 years old, he and I talk every Sunday morning, and I tell him all of the things that I have in my week, and I tell him all the requests I've gotten and all the, like, he just helps me manage that sort of like intense, like Heather has way too much work and too many things have happened and she needs to try and figure out where to focus first. Or we'll talk through, okay, I saw this weird thing happen in that meeting, but I don't quite understand what they were saying. Can you give me some feedback or guidance on what you think might have happened? And like I said, I do that every single week, and I am so incredibly grateful to my father for that type of guidance. Now, my father was never a professor, but he did work as an executive in an auto parts company. And so his understanding of that sort of complex social world is really helpful in my role as a university professor. But if we go over to Veronica, both my dad and I, so my dad was this executive director or whatever, right? But he started out driving a truck for the company. And he just had this amazing mentor who believed in him. And my father says believed way too much in him, but regardless, believed in him and kept giving him promotions and giving him more opportunities and guiding him. And that's who Veronica has been. Veronica and I met when I was in grad school. She was assigned to me to be my mentor as the Autism Research Training Program. And this was just for all trainees. This was not because I was autistic. All trainees got this opportunity to have this amazing mentor. She then sat on my dissertation committee as an examiner. She acted as a reference for the job that I now hold. And she continues to try and help me navigate that complex social world that I don't necessarily always intuitively understand. I guess my point of this sort of section is that autistic people often think, or non-autistic people often think, that we don't care about making friends or having close connections. And the research just doesn't support that. We actually do care a great deal about making friends, and we really do value our close connections. But one of the things we have to remember is that when we're talking about relatedness in autistics, you have to remember that fitting in and belonging are actually two very different things. So fitting in requires changing who you are in order to be valued or accepted, whereas belonging means that you're valued just as you are. There are a lot of links between social skills training, camouflaging, and decreased mental health. So social skills classes are like peers that I mentioned earlier, are actually often disliked a great deal by many autistics, and they may diminish authenticity by encouraging us to camouflage our true feelings, beliefs, and behaviors to better align to neurotypical norms. And so camouflaging and masking strategies are what we often use to blend into one's social surroundings and present a more socially acceptable version of oneself by hiding our more obvious autistic traits and behaviors. While we all camouflage, for autistics, it can be a bit more sinister because of the sense of fear that we have if we're ever found out, or that sense of shame we have if we don't necessarily act the way that we intended. So autistics who regularly camouflage often have internalized the stigma that their natural autistic tendencies are not acceptable ways to behave. And while causal patterns often are unclear, this constant maintenance of what we call a facade of normality is often reported to be associated with increased feelings of worthlessness, exhaustion, and decreased mental health. So the hypervigilance that can be associated with camouflaging is clearly seen in some of these autistic participants' reflections. For example, camouflaging for the one participant meant constant overthinking of the possibilities of what to say, how it will come across, what others are saying and are not saying, the connotations of every word, sentence structure, emphasis, body language, as well as all of the above, combined in a giant matrix of thought. So it's little wonder that once our eyes are opened to the fact that we need to quote unquote monitor everything that we say or do in case it's going to be to avoid the stigma and discrimination of acting autistic, we often end up with these co-occurring social anxiety disorders. And that can just make it even harder for us to form those valuable connections that we so desperately need. So there's a picture of my boy at 17 years old playing his laptop video games with his headphones on, because I can't think of a better example of my son being his true, authentic self. So what are my recommendations? Well, first, families, clinicians, service providers, teachers, we have to ensure that autistic people are not coerced into learning social skills for the sake of the neurotypical people around them with whom we interact. At the same time, we can all support those autistic people who may be genuinely motivated to learn how to quote unquote speak neurotypical to achieve various self-chosen outcomes, like to be a more effective communicator in a workplace dominated by neurotypicals. Third, we need to encourage autistic people to join groups with other neurodivergent peers who have similar interests, because members of such groups often feel great kinship for one another, and these neurodivergent groups provide opportunities for meaningful friendships without needing us to mask or normalize our quote unquote odd behaviors. And then last, if we want autistic individuals to thrive, we must work hard to increase each autistic child's confidence in themselves by conveying to them that they are good enough as they are right now, not as they might someday be in the future. The more we can believe in each student's strengths, the more that we can see the good in them as they are, the more that they will grow up believing that they have value and worth. So what are interests? Well, interests are what we care about. It's what we spontaneously give our attention to, and they're what we value, even if only briefly. According to Benson's and Scales' model, people who thrive tend to have a spark, or maybe several sparks. And they defined a spark as a passion for a self-identified interest, skill, or capacity that metaphorically lights a fire in a person's life by providing energy, joy, purpose, and direction. So, as most of you probably already know, being intensely focused on a particular subject or an activity is considered a defining feature of autism. As many as 95% of autistics have intense or passionate interests. And because of this, the special interests of autistics should theoretically hold great promise for fostering our ability to thrive, because our time spent pursuing our special interests can often amount to that of a part-time job. So to truly know a person with autism, you must know our special interest areas. It is not just enough to acknowledge that our passionate interests are important to us. We define ourselves by our special interests, and after our family, our passionate interests are often the most important thing in our lives. But it's also really important to point out that society loves to pathologize the special interests of autistics. Because seriously, if my intense special interest was the Edmonton Oilers, no one would bat an eye. For example, when I was in high school and the beginning of undergrad, one of my intense special interests was General Hospital. Because this was the 90s, I used a VCR to record General Hospital every day while I was at school, and then I'd watch it as soon as I got home. I collected pictures of all my favorite characters, like Brenda and Sunny shown here, and I pasted the pictures into scrapbooks. When Brenda wore an outfit that I particularly admired, I had my mother-in-law, who was obviously not a mother-in-law at that point, but regardless, I had my mother-in-law, who was a seamstress, recreate the outfit for me. I even traveled to Walt Disney World in Florida one summer to attend the ABC Super Soap Weekend, and I waited in line for hours to get Brenda's photograph. But as you might expect, my mother hated my obsession with General Hospital, and we had endless fights about it. Often because I refused to ever miss even a single episode. But nothing my mother ever said or did impacted the intensity of my obsession. Now, eventually my interest in GH did wane, although it held me in its grip for almost a decade. But it did fade naturally all on its own. Years later, a psychologist explained that I had used GH to learn about the neurotypical world, because in a soap opera, the plots progress very, very slowly, and all of the emotions are exaggerated. So GH becomes the perfect training ground for me to learn to understand how your brains are perceiving, understanding, and interpreting the world. The key point is that while my mother could not see any value in my obsession, the one reason that my interest was so intense was because I was learning. I recently conducted a really small qualitative study where I asked a group of autistic AFABs, which means assigned female at birth, what gets in the way of your spark? And these were some of their responses. But all of them pointed out to this idea of ableism, neurotypical expectations, and societal norms. For example, one autistic said, I made the giant societal norm sign because that is something that is always a constant thought in the back of my head about how arbitrary life is and how difficult it is for us sometimes. To punish someone by removing our intense special interest is, in essence, to strip us of a large source of comfort, soothing, and strength. In fact, a best practice is to merge our passionate interests with what we're learning at school or work. In fact, doing so may be one of the only ways for us to demonstrate our true level of ability. So strengths-based education begins with educators discovering what their students do best. Then educators help students use their strengths while learning new or difficult things so that they can reach previously unobtained levels of excellence. Ever since I first learned about strength-based education, I have been trying to understand how to use this idea to support autistic students, because I certainly know that in my specific case, this has made all the difference. So let me give you one example. I wanted to be a prof. Why I wanted to be a prof is sort of long and complex and whatever, it doesn't matter. But the point is I wanted to be a prof and I felt like I needed to do it well. Well, that belief, that need, that desire, that self-determined goal led me to practice a lot of skills that were really hard for me, like how to give an appropriate presentation, how to manage 14 million projects at the same time, how to manage 14 million deadlines that you can never remember anything for, right? And if you just said, Heather, you got to learn how to manage 14 million deadlines, I'm going to say, go away. I don't need to know this crap, right? So if you really want me to practice something that's going to be really hard for me to do, you better make sure that I can enjoy doing so, because no one on this planet is going to be able to practice something that makes them miserable all day, every day. 2021, Wood actually ran a study, and she was looking at the advantages of incorporating intense or passionate interests into the educational curriculum of students with autism. And these are many of the positives that she noted. So she talked about improved access to learning, curriculum, and tests, greater task completion. They had more communication, because obviously, if you ask me to talk about my special interest, I'm probably going to talk to you for a really long time. Greater independence, more intrinsic enjoyment of the activity, a source of comfort, and the development of expertise. Now, I cannot come up with a better real-life example of using strengths to guide learning than this photo of my boy. In grade 4, his most favorite thing in the world was Minecraft. But unfortunately, his least favorite thing in the world was school and homework. Homework was almost worse in some ways because his despised school world was even invading the privacy of his home world. Now, I fully admit I did not have many educational wins with my boy, but this is one example where I did. I was able to use his intense love of Minecraft and his innate love of science to get him to comply and even put in effort into making the science fair poster. Essentially, we set up a project where Aiden made similar sized structures using different materials, and then we measured how long it took to blow up each structure. This allowed Aiden to explore the properties of different materials in a very hands-on way, and his love of blowing things up kept him engaged and focused on the task. So by using Aiden's innate love of Minecraft, I was able to create an engaging and an interactive way for him to explore these scientific concepts. And it helped him stay motivated and interested in the project, making it a more effective learning environment for him. And here is a picture of my very good friend and colleague and another autistic advocate named Patrick Dwyer. He actually works on, he's at UC Davis. He's doing his doctoral work at UC Davis. And he actually gave the presentation last year that Jennifer referred to at the beginning of our presentation. But this is one of the slides from that other presentation. And what Patrick talked a lot about was this idea of social skills training. Like often autistics are put in social skills training because we don't understand how to behave and we need to go learn, right? And that's like demoralizing. It's horribly boring. It sucks. And I can go on in great detail, but the training programs often aren't that effective. In other words, most people don't make friends the way they're teaching us to make friends in those programs. But what Patrick wanted to bring everyone's attention to was that where he learned social skills the best was actually in theater. Now, Patrick was intrinsically motivated to act, and he wanted to become a good actor. Well, what is acting? Acting is about taking the perspective of the other, understanding empathy, building, relationships. You get to try on different roles and see how characters react to those roles. And it's not about us having broken social skills. Here is a natural environment where everybody's leveled the playing field. We all need to practice these skills, and we're all learning together. And so he talked about how it was easier because it helped to have a focus, because when you're doing acting, it's very like the process for understanding how to practice your script and how to act on the stage. All of that is much easier because it's not like we're just going to talk about anything randomly. We've got a clear focus for the discussion. But then we talked about how it's more authentic, obviously, because everyone's learning together. And then we talked about how much more fun it is. Given that young people with sparks appear to have richer and more meaning-filled lives, the autistic tendency to develop passionate interests should actually be nurtured as a strength that it is, rather than be suppressed as some kind of sense of clinical impairment. And if we go back to that Lamb et al. Study, they actually did report that an integral part of experiencing well-being for autistic adults includes having opportunities to engage in personal interests and hobbies that give us enjoyment and fulfillment. So I have one more section on presumed competence, but are there any questions or comments?
I was going to say, just this whole conversation about special interests, it's something we make reference to often when we provide our trainings as well, but just if we just look at ourselves, right, and what we're doing the things that we're passionate about. Otherwise we end up burning out and leaving and moving on to find something different to do anyways. So I don't think it's anything very specific to any one population of people. It's more of recognizing that goes across the board, right, for everyone. So how can we bring that into the various things that we do, or what we're presenting, or our ability to help us connect or present information. The Minecraft Science Fair poster was so like on point, as I have my own children who similarly don't like to do schoolwork, and homework invades your home life. And why do I have to continue doing this? I just did it for 6 hours over here, right? But we put those things in place in order to try to keep the learning going, right? To test the knowledge, all of the various reasons why we do it. But if we are going to do that, again, why can't we, like you said, make that connection to those special interests to help to really process and bring it and make meaning of it. I also love your sharing of your connection to General Hospital and just your understanding of it, right? And your coming back afterwards sharing that you used it as a way to really go through and learn, and it slows it down, and you're 100% correct, right? It's so exaggerated. It allows for so much time and space to hear things. So yeah, so thanks.
It's not much surprise I became a psychologist, eh? Clearly that was my interest, right?
So yes, thank you. I appreciated that section and that info.
One caveat is I've often heard, well, they won't do anything but their special interest. They won't try anything unless it's their special interest. So how can you possibly allow them to have their special interest when that's all they'll ever do? Like, that can be sort of the counter argument. I mean, that's completely 100% true. I can say that for me, one strategy has been is that I have to do everything else first. So if I get my intense special interest, once I get my intense special interest, it's painful to go from my intense special interest to something crappy. So I've learned that for my own personal world, I have to delay. I can't allow myself to do those really fun things, or else I get too grumpy when I need to do other things. And so that's just one strategy I have personally used. Another thing, though, I think it's important to remember is often the reason you don't want us to talk about our special interests is because it's annoying you. And I'm not saying it's not annoying. It is annoying. I understand that. But it's not harming us, right? Like, we're actually experiencing well-being by telling you about these fantastic, cool things that interest us. But you've heard it so many times that you're like, will you please stop talking? But is that really about me, or is that about you? Do you sort of see what I mean?
So I have a question about that. And I guess it goes back to this classroom perspective, right? And what you're saying about once you get it, it's painful to go away from it, right? So we talk about the use of first thens,
Yes.
right? So first we're going to accomplish this, then we can have access to that. And having those conversations about all of it. And yes, love doing it, right? We each love doing it as well. But how do you approach it? Or what are your thoughts around looking at it as a more classroom-wide well-being, and how do we fit within this classroom environment, right? Yeah. So everybody in that classroom can be their own different person, right? But we have this community that we're part of and need to work together to make it keep going. So how does that play into those conversations?
I know it's kind of, so I'm not totally sure what direction you're coming from, so I may be taking it in the wrong slant, but I guess I almost wonder if it's around like creating almost like a positive niche for that individual student within the larger positive niche of the entire classroom, right? So when we talk about positive niche construction, it's often, and I got one slide on this at the end, but it's around how do you create the environment that is the most supportive for the classroom or the learners, right? And there's many ways you can adapt the environment by using UDL or assistive tech or whatever. But one of my students gave me a hard time because I marked him low on his assignment, and he said it was the student's responsibility to create a positive niche in the classroom. And I nailed him for that. And I'm like, no, it's the teacher's responsibility to create the positive niche. But I actually think he had a good point because he argued with me. He was trying to suggest that, yeah, it's the teacher's job to provide, a sort of global structure of what a positive niche or a perfect learning environment might look like. But then they have to work with the student, individualize their own positive niche within that bubble, right? And so for that autistic student, I'm sort of imagining that they're with the same teacher all day. But if they're with the same teacher for the whole day or similar, is that a good round, Jennifer? Is that the right? Should I think of it like that, or were you thinking of it slightly different?
So I think that's one aspect of it. The other piece that I was thinking about is related to the comment of, they're talking, and it's annoying, right? And that's annoying to us. But at some point, what I think
Yes.
more of how does that fit within being able to go through an entire day if we're in a place where we have to go to school and we're learning and doing that, how do we fit that within continuing the movement and progression across our day where it doesn't come across as I'm telling you to stop because I'm annoyed by it, but more of I need to redirect you so we can keep moving forward with what we have scheduled for the rest of the day.
I think in that case, you're looking at more like an acceptance and commitment type therapy, like a strategy. So acceptance and commitment therapy is a form of therapy that's been somewhat effective for people with autism. And one of the first tenets of that therapy is to look at the big goals or the overarching goals or the overarching, and then because when you become quite dysregulated, right? So one of the ways to sort of navigate through that is to look at those big goals. So I wonder if it's just around respecting their dignity, saying, I really want to hear about your intense special interest, the Titanic, but the larger overarching goal or value that we hold as a classroom is that we're going to accomplish A, B, and C. And we can't accomplish A, B, and C if we talk about that right now. Is that kind of in line with what you were thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's just this idea of we can do that while honoring and respecting that, but still continuing to go through our day and show the commitment and connection to the overarching goal, whatever it happens to be.
It's not about not interrupting us. It's more about what are you saying about the need to interrupt us. If the need to interrupt us is so that we can move on with the curricular objectives, interrupt us, go for it. But if the need to interrupt us is just, you don't want to listen to me, that might be more problematic, right? So I know almost all teachers know about self-determination theory, but it doesn't matter. It's still an important theory. So obviously, self-determination theory is that all humans have an inherent positive tendency to move towards growth, and that we all have three core psychological needs. And so the first is competence, which is the feeling of mastery and accomplishment. Then there's autonomy, which is being able to make your own choices, or the degree to which a person is able to act according to their preferences, their interests, and their abilities. And the feeling of relatedness, or the feeling of belonging and connection. So obviously we already covered relatedness, but now we're going to look towards competence and autonomy. So my son actually made me an art painting. Like it's very abstract. It was like grade 7, but he brought it home from school. And this was the quote that was on it by Picasso, that the meaning of life is to find your gift and the purpose of life is to give it away. And given my focus on building autistic well-being, this became particularly prophetic that Aiden sent it home to me. And so basically the main message of this section is to learn to use your autistic traits to your best advantage. So there's actually something called the interest model of autism, and it highlights the important advantages of these sort of autistic cognitive style. And for those of you who care about such things, they talk about us having a monotropic tendency, or that's the ability to highly focus on a few interests. And so like I mentioned before, there was a study that was done in 2021 where they were looking at they were looking at employees, so autistic adult employees, and they were trying to basically summarize the main strengths that these autistic employees felt they had in the workplace. And here's a whole bunch of different common autistic strengths around, being logical and systematic, honest and trustworthy, meticulous, and so on. But let's just take one of those strengths. This is sustained and intense focus, and see what happens in terms of this idea of developing competence. So sustained and intense focus is an example of how you might use your autistic strength to your best advantage. So those successful women in the Webster and Garbus study, they reported that their ability to focus on a goal was one of the things that helped them most when they encountered problems. In fact, the autistic proclivity for this ability to intensely focus may actually make it easier for us to enter into Csikszentmihalyi's flow state. Because it makes it easier, because our ability to hyperfocus may make it easier for us to enter into flow, it also suggests that being hyperfocused is actually leading to a great deal of well-being for autistic individuals. But intense and sustained focus leads to more than just well-being. It actually also leads to the development of expertise. And so as teachers, we always want kids to learn deliberate practice, because deliberate practice is characterized by a high degree of focused effort to develop specific skills and concepts that are beyond one's current abilities. Deliberate practice is not just about repeated performance, it's actually about effortful practice that pushes learners beyond their current performance. For instance, playing basketball games is one way to get better at basketball, but if you just play basketball games and you never actually practice the skills, it generally leads to what we call a performance plateau. And then to escape said plateau, players actually need to step away from the games that are actually the reason for playing basketball, and then put in dedicated effort to improving their shots and their moves and their general conditioning. The importance of quantity was first sort of captured by Erickson and his colleagues in 1993. So they actually ran a study where they compared the violin students at a prestigious Berlin School of Music. Some of the students at this school were preparing to become music teachers, but others were preparing for careers as concert violinists. What these researchers found that those who wanted to be a concert violinist, i.e. more of an expert, they practiced alone and not for fun almost about 24 hours per week. When they looked at the music teachers, the people who wanted to become music teachers, they practiced on average for about 9 hours a week. So you can imagine that over many, many, many years, these differences are going to actually accumulate into thousands of hours of practice. One source of evidence that expertise depends on practice and not from innate ability actually comes from this study of both taxi drivers in the UK, in London, and from chess experts. So chess grandmasters, they can actually remember the placement of the pieces on a game board extremely well. And so if a chess master looks at a game board, they'll be able to remember exactly where all the pieces are, and they can probably theorize what the next best move is. But that completely changes if you put those chess pieces randomly. If you just randomly put the chess pieces on the board, these chess masters are not any better at knowing what was there or what they saw than any of us. So what this shows us is that these grand chess masters, they actually don't have outsized memories for every visual construct on the board, but rather they have a very superior visual spatial memory recognition for these sort of well-known movements or well-known placements of chess pieces. So the other idea of taxi drivers, which I thought was really, really cool, is they were looking at black cab or black. So in the UK, they have these sort of black taxi cabs, and those are the official taxis of the UK. And to become one of those black cab taxi people, you have to be able to memorize all of the incredibly complex streets in London and be able to just give it back to them. And then they compared those individuals with bus drivers. And bus drivers in the UK, they still get lots of hours of practicing driving on the roads and so on and so forth, but they don't have to demonstrate that memory recall the way that these black cab drivers do. And what was really, really interesting, is it's around this sort of, I totally sort of forget the finding. Now I feel stupid, but regardless, forgive me. The main finding essentially is that these black cab taxi drivers ended up appearing to have this sort of superior memory, but really it was more about practice than it was about the fact that they were somehow significantly different than the other people. The sum of all this is if you've got a hyper-focused tendency like I do, you can, and I'm willing to put in thousands of hours to memorizing specific patterns and areas of interest that I find interesting, that is something that you probably want to nurture, because that is something that will lead to the development of expertise. And it was interesting too, that these studies often talked about how important learning was, and it was often considered essential to the well-being of autistic adults. So in one study, they talked about the importance of learning to become a better self, especially around being more self-reflective. And they also talked about the importance of stepping out of one's comfort zone, and reported that seeking out new experiences allowed them to grow and mature in the long run. What was really also really cool is that many of the people, even though in the Webster and Jarvis sort of study, we were looking at sort of these autistic AFABs that had gone on to be successful as defined by them. But what was really cool about that study is that most of these autistic women, even though they were now successful, had had numerous early failures, like dropping out of school or experiencing problematic relationships and so on. But they were all able to identify inner qualities or inner strengths, which enabled them to persist in times of difficulty, and that ultimately allowed them to succeed in some way. They also talked about in these studies how important it was to see yourself as an agent of change. So many of the autistic AFABs had, even though they had faced all of these significant obstacles, like abusive relationships, loneliness, failure at work, at school, and some of them had even experienced prison. All of them, however, at some point in their life had made at least one key decision to take charge of their life and to create an alternative and more constructive future. Another thing that I think is really important to sort of point out just before we close is this idea that there are a number of autistics who believe that they are doing really well. There are a number of autistics that are existing together in environments and niches that they've constructed, and they're able to do really well. And we need to highlight that, because I can remember when I first read a study, I can't remember when. I remember when I read the study, though, it said something about autistics were generally happy. And I remember being incredibly confused. I was like, what do you mean autistics are generally happy? I'm not happy. I'm generally miserable. Like, what is going on here? The problem is that too often all we hear is about the mental health problems. All we hear is about the mental health challenges. Well, there is another side. There are some of us that are doing really, really well in ways that we personally have defined as doing well. And that's really key too. Like, what my son may never go to university because he is not particularly interested in school. And maybe for my son, doing really well is working on my cousin's farm. And yes, he really does do that, and washing dishes. Maybe it's not in line with the expectations that I hold for myself. But as a mother, what I want more than anything else is for him to be employed and for him to be happy. And if those are the two choices that he makes to make both of those things happen, then that has to be good enough, and it is. Valuing neurodiversity means that you understand that those who are wired differently from what is considered the norm are not bad or disabled, and they don't need fixing, but we're merely different. But if you are an autistic person or a family member, or you're supporting someone who is autistic, I urge you to look for the bright spots, because when it's time to change, the pathway forward is always what things are already working. And then once we figure out what is already working, we have to then ask us a deeply unnatural question of how can we do more of it? And I know that for myself, that has been we call it most sort of like a hope scavenger hunt. I need to look, I need to pay attention to everything that's going on around my world. And I need to sort of think, okay, well, what things are going really well for me? What times do I experience well-being? What times do I feel happy? And then I try and keep going in those directions. So, thank you. Are there any questions?
A lot of really great information that we're trying to kind of digest and process and create some, at least on my end, create some meaning right?
I
As
totally
to
understand.
how does that connect back to what we're doing? But I saw someone come off of mute and I want to invite
Yeah,
them.
that was me. Hi. I really love what I've been hearing and just getting your perspective on what it's been like for you, what it's been like for your son. Some of the students that I work with, it's the motivation for them to um, basically they're struggling with functioning. They're getting a negative pushback from teachers. So I'm really trying to figure out ways to motivate them, or just to at least help them see pros and cons of if they um, do certain things, then they might get a negative reaction. They might have some failing grades. So I've heard a lot of what you said about, helping, seeing if we can try to connect flow activities, so they feel more successful, helping them see some of the fun and motivation in what in the making some tweaks and changes here and there. I don't know what my question is exactly. I just, that's what I'm struggling with is, like I have a student who, it's funny enough, it's Minecraft, and he wants to bring his laptop and open it and play games in every class rather than listen to the teacher. And I'm telling him, you can't do this. This is, it's not okay that you have to do the learning and the teaching, and do the work first, and then afterwards, maybe, and I don't say it this way, but I'm basically thinking, there's friends to be made out there, and there's benefits to having friends, even friends you could play Minecraft with, but he's missing out on a whole social piece because it's all about when can I open up the laptop and play Minecraft again. So I don't know exactly what my question is, but it's a struggle that I have.
I think the problem with computers, or the biggest problem that I found with computers, is that when you're playing a computer game, you're getting every single thing that your brain needs and desperately doesn't have in a traditional classroom, right? Like you're giving the sensory environment, you're engaged, you're motivated, like everything in that sensory world is perfect. And often that disconnects from going from that perfect world to this crappy world is really hard. So I don't know if that's, so often we have to almost like so it's like that they call it a sense of resistance. So if you do anything around mindfulness, they talk a lot about resistance and trying to go into those like it's almost learning to tolerate your distress in some ways, but also I'm not really explaining myself right.
I'm glad you're struggling with it too.
I think what I'm trying to say is mostly that these sensory worlds are very bad for our brains and we can't get unhooked from them. We desperately want that perfect sensory world, and nothing that you say is going to make me change my mind. And I hear what you're saying. Like, it's an incredibly, like, how do you motivate that kid that he doesn't actually want to play Minecraft, that he actually wants to practice arithmetic?
Yeah, it's hard to compete with a computer, and Minecraft's more fun than talking with me and learning whatever skill. I get that. And sometimes that's how I come at it, is I think I heard, in order to melt away the resistance, you go over to their side, and I say, I get it. I get why you would rather play this because it's so much more fun. You get to do a lot of things that you want to do. And if the people around you are letting you do it, that makes sense. And sometimes they don't have enough space on their own side because you've sided with them so much that they're like, well, actually, I'm pretty lonely at lunch. So I try to get there by being genuine
Yes.
and pointing out all the great things they do have.
But even what you
but I
just
want,
said is perfect, right? Like if you can get them to even start thinking about when there are times that are good, right? Like that's often the trick. Like, can you get them to just shift their attention to even kind of agree? Like, yeah, you're right. I kind of do want friends. Or yeah, you're right. If I play Minecraft all day, every day, then I'm not doing these other things. And that's what I mean. And then you have to sort of get them to focus on the commitment or the value that they have. Like, do you agree that education is important and that we're going to need to learn? You sort of see what I mean? I know it's
yeah.
very complicated, but some of those strategies from that sort of like traditional psychotherapy, you might find actually quite helpful in getting those kids, especially acceptance and commitment therapy, which is all about focusing on the big picture of why we're doing these things rather than getting caught up in the minutia of it's more fun to play video games than practice math.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. It's really nice to hear your perspective and what it's been like for you and your son too. So I appreciate you sharing all that.
Yeah. I know for me, another thing that's really hard is it's how long I'm allowed to hyper focus. Like, I know that we often say, well, if you do 50 minutes of homework of math class, you can have 15 minutes on your iPad. Well, 15 minutes is not, I'm just going to go into my hyper focus and you're going to rip me out again. Like, there's no way. I've learned that if I want to go, so my hyper focus right now is rolling my body because I tend to be quite sore. Like, I'll sort of go into meditative and I'll roll with balls and so on and so forth. If I tell myself I got 10 minutes to roll, I'm not doing it because I'm going to be late for my meeting. There's no way for me to unhook in 10 minutes from that process. So how long do I need? At least 20. And I much prefer half an hour, right? And so some of those strategies, like you can't, like I know your intention is good, but if you just give me my special interest, I get hooked and then you pull me out again, that's actually going to make it harder, not easier.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, to actually ask them, well, what is the amount of time you need, and maybe potentially negotiating,
yeah, like
Minecraft.
exactly. Like, can you give me an hour if I do a longer session, right? Like, I know it's going to be hard if I'm moving from class to class and I have different teachers, but if there was any way to like sort of say, okay, well, you need me to focus for a longer period of time, and then I get a longer period of time with my special interest, it may work better for me. I know it could not work better, but you sort of see what I mean.
I do. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments or tricky things you're dealing with?
So if you go back to the whole being pulled out of the special interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
What you were saying about rolling, but I even was thinking along the lines of Minecraft and knowing some what if we were able to make a connection related to the completion of an activity within it? So it's not so much, right, the time span, but more of, hey, you can go in and do beginning and it. So there's
yes,
a
that
full
might work. Like a whole, like if there's a natural reason, like say it was like a video game, like you're gonna pass this level, right? And then because there's a natural completion, then there's no arguing about when done is, right? It's just, yeah, that would work for sure. Any other comments or questions?
I have more questions, but I want to wait and see if someone else has one.
Were there any in the chat that I missed?
In the chat, there's a lot of thank yous and the appreciation for your, it says, this was a fantastic
Hi.
presentation. Oh, go
question.
ahead, Amanda.
Sorry, I do have
No.
a question. So
Yeah.
this is separate from like sensory regulation, right? So instead of rewarding them, we don't want to reward with sensory regulation. We want them to have that sensory regulation. So for example, if a student needs that deep pressure, we're not saying, oh, you have to do this before getting that deep pressure.
No,
Right?
no,
Like
no, that's a very
okay,
good point.
good.
Yes.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
no.
But it's more of like, so I have a student, she's non-speaking. I'm a speech pathologist assistant.
There you go.
So I'm working with her AAC device. And she likes books. So for me, it's not easy, but I can apply that book in session and asking questions with her AAC device. But in class, you know, sometimes that book can get in the way. So is it more of, okay, if you do 3 math problems, we can talk about a page, kind of like that way?
No, because that's just what you're
I want to
describing.
make sure.
What you're describing is a behaviorist strategy, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing to do. That is right. But what you're saying, it's basically like, do the behavior that you hate, and then I'll reward you with something you like. Those types of strategies.
I want to make sure. Yeah.
That type of strategy.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I may have not understood. Go ahead. You correct yourself, okay?
No, I think you're. No, I think you're right, because I was just making sure, because I see that in the classroom and I'm like, let's try to get away from that. Let's not do that to them, you know.
It doesn't work long term. Like it's our last resort, because the problem with the reward is that the reward, once you achieve it, it automatically reduces its salience, right? Like, so if I get my first A ever and my mom says, oh my God, you got an A, that's fantastic, right? That's a huge reward for me. But then once I have 20 A's, that same reward, oh, you did a great job, isn't going to be meaningful. And so when we use those sort of extrinsic rewards, we have to keep upping the ante if we want them to be effective. But then as classroom teachers, we can't possibly up the ante far enough to make it meaningful, right?
Yes.
So that's why I see what you're saying. It gets in the way, but it's more like you have to find an activity that is intrinsically meaningful, that encourages her to talk.
Yes, and that's what I've kind of talked to the teachers about, is finding their interests and trying to incorporate it. I had a student that she was singing one day. So I used singing in my therapy, in my session. And then I told her one-on-one, I'm like, if she wants to sing, use it when she's doing work. So try to add that singing tone into, 2 + 2 is 4, you know, trying to grab her attention, like something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. If that was meaningful for her. Or maybe it's that she has to count the words in the book, right? So if she's practicing adding, can we get her to add the words that are on the page, right? And use those as her fodder for her words, right? Like she might be more engaged. Or can we count how many times they use the word she? How many, or will they get more she's on one page or more she's on another page, right? Like
that's a good way. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding what you were explaining to us.
No,
and then make sure I transition that into the classroom. So, okay, great.
I think you are.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Any other questions? I want to read to you the comments in the chat. So this was a fantastic presentation. Will this be recorded? So we did share it'll be recorded. Amazing and helpful information. Thank you. Dr. Brown, your presentation was amazing, authentic, and very, very helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. This was great information, and it was great to hear it from your perspective. And thank you from a fellow Canadian. I appreciate your insight and presentation, Dr. Brown.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Did you have any? You said you had another question, Jennifer. What was it?
I do have a question, and I'm sure it's going to get us into a rabbit hole. So I'm trying to think about my specific around this question. So it is related to social skills training and providing that and supporting that. And I asked this specifically because it is something that comes up all the time, right? And also because I am a person that provides the peers training, and I know your thoughts around that. So I am going to be just basically upfront about it. I offer it.
It's okay.
I don't offer it exactly the way it's offered through UCLA, because
Yeah.
I know that it doesn't meet the needs of our population, specifically within our high desert community. We have a lot of variation, and we have tons and tons of referrals that come in. And if I were to base it solely on the fact that you need an IQ of above 70, half
Yeah.
of our kiddos wouldn't receive any of that support,
Mhm.
right? So we do modify and support kids as they're coming in, and matching it to what's your level of understanding? Is there a way I could present this more visually? Is there a way we can pull you one-to-one and talk about it in practice and those different things? But I was wondering, where I often struggle, and I know this is part of the interview process that we do. We meet with the families, we get the information from the referral, and we meet with the teen as well to go through and explain and get their thoughts about, hey, should I be a part of this? Is this something I'm even interested in? The piece that I struggle with is what to do when the teen's like, really, I don't think you're going to meet my need, or really, I don't have an interest in what you're wanting to present. But then we have parent pushing, right? And we also have a referral coming in from a specific way. How do you
Navigate that nightmare?
Yeah, and because we will continue to move forward. And what we've done, and I guess I want your feedback related to this, is gone in and honored that. I hear you. I'm gonna let you know these are the different things. I'd love it if you'd be willing to come in and give it a try and talk about it as we go through. And we've done check-ins, and some kids, they drop out because it really wasn't what they want, and others end up following through. But I'm wondering, is there maybe an additional component to add in to really hear and honor their voice related to it, but also navigate the system that we're in?
So do you think it might work to present it differently, like to present it as if we're learning to speak neurotypical, because at some point we might be in a workforce dominated by neurotypicals? Like, would that kind of reasoning work, do you think, or would they still say, I don't care?
So honestly, I don't know the answer to that, because I haven't really, tried it that way, right? More thought about it in relation to its content for friendships, making and keeping friends, right? And we get into the conversations around, who do you hang out with? Do you want someone to hang out with, and things of that sort. But never really approached it from
Employment angle?
Yeah.
It might sit well, right? Like, if you said, instead of saying, we want you to have friends and we want you to make friends, I know we do, but instead of presenting it that way, what if it's like, we want you to have successful relationships with these neurotypicals you're going to have in the workforce, and we can't choose the neurotypicals that we work with, so we have to learn these stupid skills to, you know what I mean? Like, it's really about, are you approaching it from the fact that I'm broken, or are you approaching it from the fact that maybe this is just information that will be useful to me at some point? I don't know if that would help or not. I know that a number of the autistic advocates that I work with talk about it in that way, and we certainly think that it would help a great deal if it was simply presented as, this is not because you're stupid and you don't understand how to make friends. This is just because they have weird cultural rules that you need to learn. Does anyone else think it might work?
I mean, I like that. I like that a lot.
I know with the kids, my former students, is if they understand the purpose.
Yeah.
So even though they may not agree, but it's almost like learning a foreign language.
Exactly.
It's a foreign language that they're trying to learn so they can move and be successful in the areas that they want to go into.
Yeah, and always trying to say your social skills aren't broken, you're not deficient. We're just going to teach you these rules so that you don't get discriminated against or you're not facing stigma. I mean, one of the biggest ways one of the biggest barriers is that we can't pass the job interview, right? Like no one will give us a chance because we don't know the right words to say in the interview, right? And so like, from that perspective, I can see that I would want to, if I was an autistic, like, right? I would want to know those skills so I could get the job that I wanted to have. So there might be a way, but I think no matter how you make it meaningful or relevant, I think there is a way to do it. And I'm not completely against peers. Like, we do often need guidance. It's just the way that the reasons for that guidance is often done in a very dehumanizing way. Yeah, that's a good point. Are they asked what social skills they want to learn or practice? Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, right? Like, I know one of the examples they teach is like how you would approach someone at a bus stop, and they give you sort of like this, like this very detailed description of what you should say. And it doesn't seem very real. It doesn't feel very authentic or meaningful. So maybe if you had an autistic person who felt that way, you would say, you're right, this isn't totally authentic and meaningful. So maybe this isn't a strategy that will work for you. Let's try another one. I don't know. But a very good point.
But I think any program that you're trying to get students involved with, it's do it with them, not to them.
Yeah, for sure.
You know,
for sure. And the fact that if we can invite more people involved too, right? Like if it's not special classes for just us. I mean, honestly, I can't imagine there are many teenagers who don't need to practice social skills. Like, even if you do have lots of friends, right? Like, social skills and being polite are not the same thing as having lots of friends. So, I mean, there's totally ways that you could make it meaningful for everyone.
It's really funny that you mentioned that, because initially we started the peers program with only autistic individuals, but now it's across the board. We have teens that have anxiety, depression,
Right.
ADHD, autism, all over, whoever's really struggling. And that's how we've tried to normalize it. We're just talking about skills that we can put in place to, you know, feel a little bit more comfortable when we go into various social contexts.
Exactly. I mean, it's interesting though, just speaking of that, your comment about skills reminded me of the DBT skills. And I mean, I've been learning a lot about DBT right now, which is it's a form of therapy if you don't know what it is, but I came across this book. It was actually, I was evaluating an application for a grant. And the grant was to evaluate the effectiveness of this book. It's called the Neurodivergent Friendly Workbook of DBT Skills. And basically, what you might find it really helpful. You can get it on Amazon for $20. It's a workbook, and it teaches you all sorts of different DBT-like skills. And if you know the DBT skills, it's all around regulation and tolerating distress and so on and so forth. But they have a whole bunch of neurodivergent friendly twists to it. And so it talks about, like, there's one here that has a whole bunch of affirmations. And one of the affirmations that I love is, my sensory needs are real and deserve to be accommodated, right? So there's a whole bunch of different sort of, I don't know how this exactly relates to social skills training. I guess the reason I'm thinking it does is because it's really about learning about how to understand your emotions and how to manage your emotions. And to me, I guess that seems a lot like social skills. To me, a lot of the time, what autistic people are trying to hide is that we're sensory overwhelmed, that we're really upset by the noises or the smells or the whatever. And I noticed that in a lot of the camouflaging studies, they talk about how they're trying to hide that. They're trying to, one girl, she actually was on, She was a grad student, and she was so overwhelmed answering these questions from her professors, but it was on Zoom and she was off camera. So basically she would talk. She would then mute herself so they couldn't hear her, and she was sobbing. She would hear what they were saying. She would unmute herself and then hide the fact that she'd been sobbing, right? Like, it's so overwhelming for us to appear that we don't have it together. And so I guess that's sort of why I went on this tangent. Sometimes it's a lot of what we're trying, social skills is around trying to regulate our emotions. Sorry, I hope that wasn't too much of a tangent.
Not at all. In fact, we had people asking for the title.
There, yes, you got it. It's really good. I really love it. It's got all this stuff about like figuring out what zone you're in and when you need to regulate. Anyway, I hope that it's helpful. Are there any other questions on anything?
Can you clarify, is there a difference between camouflaging and masking?
There is, technically, but do you want to know the technical definition?
Yeah, I'm actually really curious about that whole field, because I do feel like it happens so often out there, and I'm trying to understand it more and be more supportive of the fact it is, and help others, or even myself, be able to recognize when it's potentially happening and how to be supportive of that.
It's really hard to figure out where camouflaging ends and social skills begins, because social skills is essentially hiding. When you, like, if I have a student, my role as a professor is to not show that I don't think you're very smart, because obviously if I make it obvious that I don't think you're very smart, that's going to hurt your well-being, it's going to hurt your educational opportunities, blah, 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 right? Well, that's essentially lying, right? But then yet that's a social skill. So it's really hard to figure out where camouflaging and so on begins. Masking is essentially not changing your inner experience and just suppressing something. So masking my stims, I don't do this, but if I stim like this, masking would just be forcing myself not to do it. Camouflaging is a bit more deep, right? And so I might change my interests to better align with the interests of my peers, or I might, like, it's just a bit more of a, it's where I'm changing parts of myself to be more socially acceptable for the people that I'm talking with. Now, again, we all do these things. Like, we all want to hide and social white lies and blah, blah. I think the cognitive dissonance, though, for people with autism is bigger, right? So we often feel it's really hard for us to pretend we don't like something because of this sense that we're being a liar, right? Or, you know, like, I think it's part of that is part of the problem. But then the other part is how exhausting it is. So it was really funny. I have these neurotypical grad students who are learning to be counselors, and I was listening to them talk, and they all had just gone on their first full day of providing counseling. And they were talking about how tired they were so exhausted, and it was so hard, it was such a long day. And I was like, why was it so hard? Like, you're just talking to people, right? And they were like, well, I'm monitoring everything I say, and I'm trying to understand what they're saying and trying to see if there's a deeper message, and there's so much, right? It's that. If you're constantly having to do that, like, theoretically, the neurotypicals would eventually figure it out and then they would relax. But if you're in that constant state of toxic stress, then it's much more likely that you're going to have serious mental health effects from that state in and of itself. And also this sense that I'm so disgusting that I have to hide everything of who I am can be really hard on your ability to sort of understand yourself. Does that make any sense? Or does that answer the question?
100%.
So I always find it a bit hard because camouflaging is a skill we need to know. If I can't camouflage, I'm not going to get a job. If I can't camouflage, I'm going to have troubles with my peers. So it's not that you can just say camouflaging is bad, but rather we have to figure out that when is camouflage costly and when is it to my benefit. And I think the autistics often are arguing that you're spending too much time on forcing me to act as a neurotypical in the same way would force homosexuals to not be like conversion therapy, right? Like you're just not homosexual, just stop being that way, right? It's sort of that idea, but you can't go to either extreme. We have to find a balance, right?